like to call this meeting to order. Are there any opening remarks from anyone?
Any opening remarks from committee members? None over here.
Seeing none, I'd like to have a motion for the approval of July 19, 2019 meeting minutes.
Second.
So Bill Lamar makes the motion and David Rothbard seconds.
Duly noted. Are there any nays?
Nope, none over here.
It seems unanimous as an aye, so we don't need to do roll call vote, do we?
No, we don't.
Okay, perfect. Moving forward, review of follow-up action items. No motion is required here, but Mr. Latorre?
Yes, there are no action items to review. So
Okay.
on that one.
So let's move on to discussion items. And proposed amendments to Rule 1403, asbestos emissions from demolition renovation activities. I like Bradley McClung.
So we're gonna have
Provide an overview.
yeah, we're gonna have Assistant
Sorry?
Deputy Executive Officer Sarah Reese give the presentation.
Good morning.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, we're just pulling up the slides here. So good morning, everybody. I'm going to give an overview of where we are on proposed amended Rule 1403, which is our regulation pertaining to minimizing asbestos emissions from demolition and renovation activities. Just to give you a little background, EPA has long ago identified asbestos as a hazardous pollutant. So over 40 years ago, it's established regulations. We call them the NESHAP regulations to minimize exposure from asbestos fibers during demolition and construction and renovation activities. And that's because we know that there's asbestos materials in a lot of building materials. So we know that during those activities, asbestos can be released. Our Rule 1403 is our version of the NESHAP. It is more stringent than the federal NESHAP, and so that's a point I want to emphasize because that comes to play in a couple of areas when we talk about specific rule provisions. We originally adopted our rule back in 1989. We've revised it several times since. The last one was over 10 years ago, so it's a bit overdue for a revision. Just give you some quick health risks of asbestos, because I think it's important to keep that in mind. It causes asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma. There's other kinds of cancers that are associated with it as well. We're still seeing impacts and health risks from asbestos manifesting, even though a lot of asbestos exposures are decreasing because those materials are being taken out of commission. We also know that symptoms take a lot of years to develop after exposure, so you can be exposed 20 years ago and not feel those effects until much later on. But in general, we know that the greater, thank you, Derek, the greater exposure you have to asbestos, the greater risk you have of developing these other diseases and having other health effects. So just an idea of the typical materials that will contain asbestos. So it's joint compound in drywall, pipe insulation, cement pipe, floor tile, gaskets. It's a variety of different building materials that people have to be cognizant of. Some of these can contain fairly significant amounts of asbestos. For example, a cement pipe can be up to 40% asbestos containing, so that's pretty substantial. And then there's different types of asbestos. So we talk about friable and non-friable asbestos. The friable stuff that can be easily crumbled by light pressure, by hand pressure, so that has more risk of releasing asbestos fibers. So examples of that would be things like insulation and fireproofing, soundproofing materials. Non-friable asbestos, that's the hardest stuff. It's usually solid, rigid. It's not easily crumbable. So things like cement pipe, roofing shingles, floor tiles, etc. So the friable stuff is the stuff that we're really concerned about in terms of exposure, but non-friable materials are also important because they can be made friable if they're cut, if they're damaged, if there's weatherization, etc. Kind of the key components of Rule 1403, there's three parts of it. The first part is a survey. You want to go in and survey and assess materials, see if you can identify asbestos-containing materials, as well as assess the condition of those materials. If it's non-friable material, is it intact? Is it posing a risk of exposure? Once you get through the survey and you've identified the materials and assessed condition, then you go to notification. And there's a minimum 10-day notification in our rules. that is actually a NESHAP requirement, so it's something that we can't waive. The reason we have a notification period is it gives us time for us to be aware of those activities, to be able to evaluate whether they're being conducted in an appropriate way. And then there are exemptions to this notification period for emergencies. And I'm going to talk about that more as we get through this rule, because that was actually a big focus of what we worked on in this rulemaking. And then the third component is treatment and removal. So there's work practices that we have in place where folks can follow those to minimize exposure to asbestos, as well as how you handle asbestos-containing waste. Our objective in going through this rulemaking, I mentioned it had been over 10 years since we had revised this rule, and we don't just, revise because it's time, but there had been a lot of ambiguities that we had seen in the rule language, and so wanting to be able to clarify those. But then we also wanted to make sure we could go through and where appropriate, our rule aligned with the federal NESHAP requirements, so we were meeting those bare minimums. And I'll refer to that a couple of times because in some of the comments that we've received, where there are things we've been asked to do that we can't do because they would run afoul of NESHAP requirements. Is there a question?
Back in the 30s, 40s, in that era, was asbestos used primarily just as a filler and insulator because it was easy to apply? And then in the 70s, of course, the EP found out that it was deadly to your health. But what was the purpose of using it? Just as a cheap filler by industry?
It's actually has very some good insulation properties and fireproofing properties, and it works fabulous for that. So it's a good application for that. It's unfortunately those characteristics also make it harmful when we breathe it in, and those fibers can get deep in our lungs. So it has important, useful characteristics, and it's still used in some applications like brake liners, for example. But it's because of the health risks, we transitioned to other materials. So real quick on our rule development, this has actually been a fairly extensive process. We started this back in the spring of 2018. We've gone through multiple working group meetings since then and have issued many revisions or draft rule language for folks to take a look at. We actually were going to schedule to go to our board early of 2019 with this rule, and at that time received a lot of concerns, specifically from folks in the water municipality districts and utilities regarding underground pipe, and so wanted to go back and take some time to work through those issues. But a lot of what we were looking at for that was pertained to emergency situations and making sure that we were appropriately addressing ways in which asbestos work can continue during emergencies, clarifying what we meant for an emergency, and then continuing to incorporate stakeholder input and comments. So it's just a summary of the key issues that we addressed. Addressed rule applicability, so we wanted to make sure that certified asbestos consultants were covered within the terms of our rule, clarify what actually was required for surveys when folks would go out and identify asbestos materials, talk about our notification requirements. We wanted to clarify what was required in terms of sampling protocols when asbestos materials were identified, what types of samples were needed for that. I mentioned our emergency situations. We revised to include provision to provide what we call a call and go procedure for when there's an imminent threat to public health or safety, and then also providing additional flexibilities to address the concerns folks involving underground pipe raised to us. So in our clarifications, for applicability, I mentioned that we included specifically the coverage for asbestos consultants. Previously, the language made the rule applicable to owners and operators, and it was implicit that certified asbestos consultants were covered by that, but it wasn't absolutely clear. And so we wanted to make sure that that was pretty clear in the rule language. On our surveys, the federal requirement for a survey is a thorough inspection. We had always interpreted that as requiring an on-site inspection of the project, and so we wanted to clarify our rule language to make sure that that was absolutely clear what was needed. And then on notifications, we have developed an online notification procedure, and that's been in use for several years at this point. And so we removed the provisions of the rule that provided written notification requirements. Everything's been online for many years, and so wanted to make sure that the rule reflected that. We did provide provisions in there so that in the event that the web system is down, there's a phone notification procedure that folks can use so that we don't have to delay jobs for that. In terms of sampling, we specified the minimum number of samples required for both friable and non-friable materials. And then we also created a separate provision when there's small areas of non-friable materials being sampled. That example was, well, say I'm remodeling a small bathroom, taking 3 samples in that small bathroom might actually ruin the floor if it turns out the floor is okay at the end of the day. And so we wanted to make sure that there was maybe 1 sample was suffice there and that work could proceed. On sampling analysis, provided the minimum standard for what analysis is required, and as well as address the analysis of composite samples. So those are samples where if you have a wallboard system where there's drywall and there's joint compound and there's mudding tape, that's considered a wallboard system. There could be asbestos in the joint compound, but not in anything else. A composite sample would allow you to combine all of that so that it would dilute the asbestos content. Our rule and our interpretation, we have never allowed for a composite sample, and so we wanted to clarify that in our rule language. So some of the modifications we made, so this is beyond clarification, but actual changes. So the definition of an emergency renovation. One change that we went into this rule knowing that we wanted to make was to require certification for emergency declaration letters. And that's because we had discovered fairly widespread fraud in these emergency declaration letters where contractors and consultants were issuing these letters claiming emergencies so they could get out from the notification period, but in fact there was no actual emergency going on. And so having that certification in there is just another extra step where if we are uncovering fraud, we're able to enforce against it. We also revised our definition of emergency renovation to include times where you go in and you unexpectedly discover asbestos-containing material, or you know you've got asbestos-containing material, but you unexpectedly discover that it's damaged or disturbed. And so the reason we did that is we heard from stakeholders there are times where they would go into a situation thinking that they knew what they were getting into, encounter asbestos, and then have to stop the job, wait the 10 days, and start the job over again. We wanted to make sure that there was a provision where in those circumstances folks could continue to do the work and get through that project and not have to wait those 10 days for the notification period. We did provide an exemption for cases where there's an emergency that poses an imminent threat to public health or safety. So the example we hear frequently about is if there's a catastrophic emergency that disrupts utility services, and do they have to wait and get approval from the district in order to be able to do the work that they need to do to address the emergency. And so what we've done in this, our current rule would require that you call the district, wait for our approval, and then do that work. What we're proposing is this call and go procedure where you would call us, so you let us know there's an emergency, you let us know there's asbestos work happening, but you just go. You deal with the situation, you take care of the emergency, you get the utilities restored. We also made a change here on the types of personnel who can perform surveys. So our current rule language requires that a certified asbestos consultant perform the survey. That's a fairly high bar. We heard from stakeholders that in many cases, they have employees who have a HERA training on building inspections, and whether it be possible for them to be allowed to do those surveys. And after consulting with Cal OSHA, thought that was a reasonable request. Cal OSHA is the body that determines what's adequate training for asbestos inspections, and they agreed that would be an appropriate bar. So we added that provision to allow that additional flexibility. There are remaining concerns, and these mostly revolve around how we address underground pipe. And so one thing we've heard a lot is stakeholders asking for a separate procedure, basically a separate work practice, very specific for buried underground pipe. What we're hearing is that underground pipe is different than buildings, so usually it's a simpler process when you go in and you address the asbestos there. And that the work it shouldn't require a prior survey, and it should be pre-approved by South Coast. We're also hearing concerns about notification and delays for reviewing what we call Procedure 5s for buried underground pipe. So Procedure 5 is a work practice that pertains to material that non-friable material that has been damaged or disturbed. Those we require that you call the district, that we get to review your plan, approve your plan, and then you do the work. We've discovered from our working group process that some utilities have always been using these Procedure 5s. We, as I'll mention in the next slide, we figured out a way that will allow people to be able to use other work practice procedures so they can get to that work faster. And then another big concern is one on surveys. I mentioned in my previous slide that we've added another category of folks who are qualified to do asbestos surveys. We're hearing from the utilities that they want to have folks who have what we call asbestos cement pipe worker certification be qualified to do these surveys. So we have added some flexibility for underground pipe on work sites that are what we call remote locations, so they're more than a quarter mile from a nearest receptor. We're allowing for a 2-day notification in those circumstances. Now, given the density of our jurisdiction, there's probably not a lot of work sites where that's eligible, but we felt that, you know, if there's a case where it truly is a remote site, the risk of exposure is pretty minimal, and so having a shorter notification period may be appropriate. We also wanted to clarify that most underground pipe is subject to what we call Procedure 3, which does not require pre-approval by the district. It's if the pipe is in good condition and you're just using non-power tools, that's the appropriate work practice, and you don't have to notify, or you don't have to wait for our approval in advance. And then we also revised our emergency provisions to address what we think are the remaining concerns. So with all of the changes we've made to our emergency provisions, in most cases, we think that you know, the utility workers can go and do their work without waiting for our approval. And then having the avenue to use this Procedure 3 instead of Procedure 5 minimizes the delay associated with that work. So in our next steps, we're scheduled to go to a stationary source committee next week on our set hearing in October, and then going to the board in November 1. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Yes, sir. This is
Are
David
there any
Rothbard.
questions from folks?
On behalf of the Southern California Alliance of Public Owned Treatment Works, we want to thank staff for providing call-and-go provisions for emergency processes. For example, wastewater treatment plant has some kind of sewer overflow, and that's kind of that priority, so we appreciate being able to take care of that issue first and then deal with the asbestos as secondary concern. However, there's still concerns as far as how to do routine work on a daily basis. And to be honest, I think a lot of people were confused about the applicability of this rule as far as what you have to survey, what you have to inspect, and it became clear to everybody recently as far as what your facility includes would be utility corridors that are not buildings, not structures, not schools, but things running thousands of miles of pipeline in streets. And what do you do there? And the interpretation we have at the moment is, even though you know it's not going to be an asbestos pipe, that you still need to do a survey. So just, I understand being safe, no one's objecting to a safe process, but we need to maintain our essential public services, and we just want to work with you to streamline that process. And that's an ongoing ask of, we thank you for the revisions, we'd like to proceed with the revisions, but we still think there's some streamlining we could work on to allow the work to go forward safely for our workers in the community. And I think we have a method moving forward. We talked about maybe having a board resolution to have staff continue to work with stakeholders to find flexibility for how to do a survey, for example, where maybe you don't have to break ground every time you go into a steel pipe. You would have something that could be surveyed up front where you're not breaking ground every time you do, say, 100 jobs a day. Why do you needlessly want to break in the ground when you pretty much know there's nothing there? So we're asking for some process to allow us to proceed forward safely. So I don't have any thoughts. I just wanted to talk about that generically.
Sure, and we appreciate that, and you know, we've certainly had a lot of good comments and discussion about this in our working group meetings. I will remind folks that a survey requirement is a requirement under the federal NESHAP, so we can't waive the survey requirement. I think there can be a conversation of what constitutes an adequate survey. EPA has unfortunately been very reticent to define what actually is an adequate survey. They've have been asked point blank whether an on-site survey or inspection is required. They have not answered that question, but they have pointed to ASTM standards and other standards that indicate that, you know, sort of screening surveys aren't sufficient, that it really is a thorough survey that is required. And when we look at what that takes, it's hard for us to get around the on-site survey requirement. It really is all about making sure that a certified professional is getting in there, taking a look at the materials, and being able to adequately assess that there's no asbestos risk posed by that, and no asbestos materials involved. So I think we're open to continuing to have the discussion, but we feel, and EPA's recent approval of alternate work practices for underground pipe actually reinforces that there's a requirement for surveying, and that's a pretty thorough inspection that is required.
On that subject, one of my members had just sent to me a procedure that Massachusetts has, where it allows having just review as-builts and to supplement that to the extent possible. So we're not trying to say you don't have to do a survey, but we do think there's wiggle room available, especially because it's underground. Generally, you have problems with friable material, but in soil, there's inherent moisture. It tends to be non-friable until you start cutting it up. So it's a very different situation where I think we could have a little more latitude, and EPA probably would agree with that, and we could work with you on that. But looking at other air districts and other states, certainly there is some wiggle room that other air districts are applying, and maybe we could take advantage of that as well.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Massachusetts regulation, but I will say the EPA has actually been clear that as-built plans are not sufficient for surveys, and it may be that it's an as-built plan in conjunction with other information that they're using in Massachusetts. The other thing I will point out on surveys is that surveys don't expire, so you can do a survey, and as long as it's still representative of the conditions of that site, that can take care of for pretty much whatever jobs you need to use. So, there are ways in which we think that folks can address those survey requirements and be assured of the condition of the materials.
So I can't see folks around the table because I think I see the presentation in front of me.
I will navigate this. So Bill Lamar,
Okay.
you're next.
Sarah, I have a question. Since we're the local government small business advisory group, that this has some bearing on certainly local government, but small business, and especially small business general contractors, small general contractors. And right now, there are a couple of alternatives. If you have a piece of property that you want demolished or renovated or something like this, you can call in a general contractor. He can look at the work, draw up some plans, send them to the planning department, the local city. They review them, sign off on them, pull the permits, and go to work. Depending on the age of the property, there may or may not be asbestos in doing that work. Is this rule going to introduce a number of extra steps on this that these contractors are now going to have to get a clearance with the district before they start work? And is there also I'm sure there's going to be, if there's a delay, then there's going to be cost involved.
This rule doesn't add any additional process steps. It clarifies the process steps that are already in place. It also provides clarity on who can conduct surveys, which have always been required. One of the things that we're found out about both in the course of the rulemaking as well as from our compliance and enforcement folks is that we think there's a lot of ignorance about the rule out there in terms of people aren't aware that it applies, aren't aware that they have to conduct surveys, aren't even aware of the types of asbestos-containing materials that are present in building materials and can cause exposure. So part of what we're doing is working to try to reach out to folks to get them aware of what the requirements are and making sure that they understand how the rule pertains to them and what they need to do to meet those requirements and stay safe.
Well, I guess I kind of understand that, but now it seems to me that in order for this rule to be enforceable, planning engineers or planning departments in all the cities there are here are going to have to notify the district that they have some plans that require their approval, and if there is suspected asbestos in the ceiling tiles or wall boards or whatever it happens to be, they're going to have to get some sort of clearance from the district. You mentioned 10 days here. The other option, as I mentioned earlier, are the do-it-yourselfers. these are folks, there's, last time I checked, it's, the do-it-yourself market is about $600 billion a year. It's huge. And I can tell you from experience, maybe not personal experience, but observing neighbors and so on, friends and neighbors, that a lot of these people don't even bother pulling permits. They do that themselves. So then now you've got a rule that is really unenforceable because you don't know what where those projects are, and neither do the city engineers. So how is that going to affect that?
So one thing I would say on the building departments, this rule is not applicable to the building departments. The rule is not is applicable to owners and operators. We are actually wanting to work with building departments and with cities to get them to better understand that when permits are issued, it would be nice if there was some notification so that the owners and operators are aware that there's asbestos requirements that they need to meet. But that does not make this rule applicable to the building departments per se. On the do-it-yourselfers, this rule is not applicable to if you own your own home and you're doing the work yourself. Are free to do that and not follow the requirements of this rule. So it's not applicable there. There's an exemption for personal homeowners that are doing this work. If you're a homeowner, and you're going to hire somebody to do the work, then the rule is applicable. But if you're doing the work itself, it is not. And we have not made a change. That was in our original rule language.
So under owners and operators then?
Correct.
So if a person hires a general contractor to do something, or a painting contractor, or several contractors to do whatever this job is, then that contractor or those contractors are required to get clearance from the district, but you're saying the building departments are not?
The building departments do not. The obligation is on the owner-operator to make sure the job is done in accordance with those rule requirements, so the contractor would get a certified asbestos consultant so that it can do the survey, et cetera. And then that's an existing requirement in the rule that's been in the rule since its inception.
Seems like there's a disconnect here somewhere, but...
Well, I think there's certainly an education piece that we acknowledge and want to be able to work with, building departments to make sure that they're aware of asbestos requirements, because we are seeing cases where, folks are renovating and on demolishing materials and getting, some fairly significant exposure.
Yeah, and then they go to David's landfill.
That's right.
See, so. Carlos?
Thank you. I want to first say that when I see the 20 stakeholder meetings and 7 working groups, that commend the outreach in advance of today's meeting. Has there been any recent correspondence from any of these working groups or any coalitions, particularly on water district front, to respond to where we are today as you're laying out to us some of the changes that the call and go, for example? What are some lingering concerns? It struck me that I didn't see any correspondence in our packet, and I'm going to get a sense of some of the lingering concerns that there might be for us to consider. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So we've had a lot of meetings with, there's a coalition of water districts who have worked together to work with us on different rule provisions. They're still concerned about how this rule applies to underground pipe and would like to see separate work practices established specific for underground pipe. I think a lot of the concerns speak to the survey requirements, which, as I mentioned before, it's a federal NESHAP requirement, and so waiving a survey is not something that we can do. But we think that there's other ways in which that work can be done that's still practical and achievable. And we think that some of the other flexibilities we've introduced into the rule language will actually help. Current rule language doesn't have those flexibilities built in, but the new rule language will. And so we think that there's pathways forward. There are already work practices that are applicable to underground pipe. It's that procedure 3 that I mentioned, which is you don't have to wait for our approval. It's if you go down and it's intact underground pipe and you're not touching it with power tools, you just keep it wet, you do your work, you take care of it, it's fine. you don't have to wait for our approval. But it are the cases where you go down and the pipe is damaged, where it's disturbed, where there's a risk of asbestos fibers being released. Those are the cases where we want to have a pre-approval, where you notify the district, we review your plan, we make sure that the work is being done appropriately. We do believe that the vast majority of underground pipe work that would be done by the water districts is probably in that procedure 3 category. The pipe's going to be in good shape. You're going to, go down with a snap cutter and put a valve in. That's not damaging or disturbing the pipe. So we're committed to working with the water districts and others to make sure that we work through their concerns, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're have the minimum requirements that the federal government requires, as well as making sure that the work that is conducted is safe.
Are we able to hear from them as far as this body here? Is that their opportunity for that?
So what we can do is we can make that an action item to see if they're willing to come out and take questions.
Okay.
If I could, I think some of the folks are in the
Oh,
audience. and
yeah,
may
we have some
comment.
folks in the audience that are stakeholders that are here, but if there's others, we can obviously have them.
Well,
send
those that
letters.
are here, are they?
They got public comment cards.
Okay,
So we go
great.
to them.
Well, it would be great to be able to have some more information. I know we'll hear from them today, but just moving on real quick. So are there implications then for cities as far as public works or those types of matters, and what type of feedback have you gotten
So
there
if-
that are
yeah,
that are
if-
lingering? That again, there's certainly been some input that has been addressed here. So we appreciate knowing that it's not falling on deaf ears, and you guys are working together here collaboratively. But just again, from a city perspective, what are some lingering concerns? And
Sure. If a city has a pipe or has structures and they're doing that work themselves, and like the rule is applicable to them, I will say the changes we've made to the rule, we haven't added any substantive requirements. All of what we're talking about in the proposal is where we've made changes. It's to provide some flexibilities. A lot of confusion has been about the fact that people weren't aware that this rule applied in the first place, and so part of that process is working with folks, is helping them understand when the rule applies, how it applies, and what you need to do to be able to meet those requirements.
has there been any formal input from OCCOG or other related city-centric entities that have weighed in on this?
We've not had formal input from OCCOG or those. We've had input from other city municipal water districts. So, and we've been working with them on this.
Okay.
As Sarah mentioned, this is going to Stationary Source Committee later on this month. So there's going to be an opportunity for stakeholders to also voice their, opinions and concerns with this rule. So.
And commercial, industrial, residential impacts related to some of the different materials. And I was looking at this drywall and floor tile. Other installation materials. Just was making me think about just the gambit of business impacts. So, what type of input has there been from the commercial, industrial, and residential groups that are, again, same question, are there any lingering concerns, and could you help us understand that?
Yeah, so the input we've had have been on it's mostly on the folks who are in the industry, in the construction industry, the asbestos consultants. We've had a lot of input from them, as well as folks on the water utility and utility side. The concerns, I wouldn't necessarily say it was concerns. There was confusion about the rule, as well as concerns about the fact that some of the provisions were ambiguous. So, for example, I'll go back to the sampling provisions. The way we had specified the sampling provisions, we didn't actually call out the number of samples that are required under specific circumstances. Working with the stakeholders, we've come up with a way to do that, so it's clear what's needed. It's backed up by rationale. It's backed up by some ASTM building standard requirements. So we were able to have that level of clarity so that folks actually know, okay, here's what I need to do, here's how many samples I need to take. But I will say that, the materials that are suspect asbestos-containing materials that I called out, that knowledge has not changed. I mean, that's always been a part of this rule. It's always been something that we've considered in enforcing this rule.
And the Orange County League of California Cities, have they been engaged in regards to this? Have they been provided any input? Are they aware? Has there been any dialogue at all?
We've not had any input from them.
Is there an opportunity for them to have that occur? Just a direct communication to them
We're certainly happy to reach out.
okay. Thank you.
Rochelle, you had a question?
I did, but Councilmember Rodriguez read my mind, so ask my questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Seeing no other, David.
Follow up, and just based on some of the questions that came up, just wanted to emphasize something Sarah said is I think there's been a lot of confusion as far as what was applicable. Like I said, you know, a lot of folks that I deal with, when you read the rule, it was interpreted in a way that based on the language, you'd say, oh, it's not applicable, but there are revisions necessary to clearly show what South Coast needs to do. And I don't think there's anyone intending not to comply, but it was somewhat confusing. So this is very timely to go and clarify this. But as to kind of bigger picture here as far as health and safety, one thing we haven't really talked about is, you know, the asphalt issue, that we're finding asphalt in roadways can have asbestos, and a lot of those roadways are not subject to the rule. Much like Bill's talking about, if someone's doing work on their home, you could be exposed to asbestos, which is not a good thing. So as part of this, maybe there should be some type of discussion of how to notify people working on roads, or have a separate process for roadways if you're doing asphalt, or people who like utilities that have to go through the asphalt. What's a reasonable way to move forward and determine how extensive this is without slowing down the process too much? And frankly, this is, you know, we talk at South Coast endlessly about a lot of contaminants, like hexavalent chromium is very, very bad. So is asbestos. But the good thing about asbestos, it's easy to mitigate. We wet it down. You make it non-friable. So maybe that's something as an education process, or a process for someone's digging up a road or digging up asphalt. Maybe there's a way to mitigate this pretty quickly. It's at least a public education process. So I wanted to bring that up. As far as cities, I think that's a really good education for the cities to say, by the way, you do work on the roadways, be advised there can be some hazards to the residents and to the city workers.
So we did become aware in the course of this rulemaking, and it's sort of independent from this rulemaking, that there are some areas where there's asbestos in asphalt. So in particular, there was one parking lot in West Hollywood that a contractor decided to sample, and those samples came up positive for asbestos. We weren't expecting to find that. Asbestos has been or in the past was added to asphalt, mostly in cold water weather areas, because it increases the strength of the asphalt. We are not a cold weather area here, so we were not expecting to find that. We're still trying to figure out the scope of that problem. I think it's premature to say that we believe that there's asbestos in all asphalts, or that it's a majority of it. It's probably in isolated areas. And so far, our data seems to bear that out, but we're still evaluating what the extent of it is and how we need to proceed.
Carlos?
The last comment just prompted me to ask then on the transportation implications then, would that apply to projects that would be on the scope of an OCTA nature, and have they provided input?
So this rule is applicable for renovation and demolition activities for facilities and facility components. So if you don't fall within that category, like just a roadway out there, that's not what this rule is applicable to. That said, if we believe and have reason to believe that there's asbestos in asphalt elsewhere, I think there's bigger issues that we need to consider. It wouldn't be within the scope of this rulemaking, but perhaps other efforts that we need to do to try to address exposure.
The matter on asphalt and asbestos, would there be then, if a city is doing some general road repair and public works related service, ongoing maintenance, things of that nature, would the clarity in the rules that are being proposed require the cities then to contact AQMD?
So again, this rule is only applicable to renovation and demolition activities for facilities. So if it's a structure, if it's a component of a facility, so pipes are involved because pipes are components of facilities, and it's considered that way under the federal requirement. But general road work, that does not qualify.
Okay. And then generally speaking, is there clarity on the amount of additional time that when it's clearly applicable that that AQMD would be contacted as part of this new clarification in rules, what the time frames would be? Do
Yeah,
we have a range? Are
if
those
it's
clear?
if it's a non-emergency, so routine work, it's a 10-day notification period, and that's specified in the rule. And that's again reflective of the federal requirements. So that's the bare minimum that we have to put in.
Would the time then be no more than 10 days?
It's a 10-day notification period that we have to have. So you have to notify us 10 days before commencing the work.
And then what about the time that there would be to get the approval, so to speak, from AQMD? Would there be an unknown time frame before AQMD would come back
So
and
for-
say,
from-
we're signing off here? Or
For most of the work practices, you don't require AQMD approval. That's just for the case. So for example, and I'll go back to the underground pipe example, if you go down, it's intact underground pipe and you're not going to cut it with power tools, that's something that we have established work practice procedures. You just follow those procedures in the rule. You don't have to get pre-approval from AQMD. It's just in those cases where we know that there's damaged and disturbed asbestos where we need to have pre-approval to make sure that we that the work is being conducted safely, but we typically turn those around fairly quickly.
Thank you. And NAOP, did they comment? Have you received input from NAOP?
We have not received input from NAOP, no.
Okay. Again, I guess my last comment would be if there's the possibility to get any correspondence to the group that you've had from the different stakeholders so we can get a better appreciation of the more recent comments and those groups that we had highlighted, particularly the Orange County League of California Cities, if they could be engaged for their input, that would be terrific.
Okay.
Thank you.
Paul Avila.
Testing, nothing as dramatic as that, but my question is, a traditional example. You've got a building that's being for demolition. All the permits have been pulled. You've got NASHAP, OSHA, all the regulations are fine. All your contractors have been licensed, so there's no mavericks, so to speak. Now, all that asphalt, and let's say it's an older building. Not so much not in the OC, but let's say here in Los Angeles, the older buildings gets knocked down. And there's a significant amount of asphalt contamination there, okay? And it could be in the walls, the concrete pipes, just the debris of asbestos. Where's that stuff all go? You can't dump that in the dump.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That material is considered asbestos containing, or I forget what exact term, we have an acronym for it, AQMD, but that has to go into hazardous waste landfill.
Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none, Derek had to leave for a quick minute. He told me to go to these questions, the blue cards. Is that correct? Speaker cards, okay. Priscilla Hamilton. And they have, is it 3 minutes? Take your time. No. 3 minutes, no more than 3 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Priscilla Hamilton. I'm an environmental affairs manager with SoCalGas. We have been closely working with staff for the past year and a half on this rulemaking and have reached agreement on several issues. However, a few key problematic issues have recently arisen. We have raised these issues at the last working group as well as the public workshop. We are hopeful that we can resolve our concerns by continuing to work with staff. We are troubled by staff's recent articulation of an asphalt sampling policy as part of Rule 1403 implementation, and we have been actively discussing this issue with staff. We agree that it is very concerning that staff has found asbestos on one city street and in one parking lot, but we think it is premature to extrapolate that asphalt is a suspect material based on 2 data points. It's clear that further investigation is needed, and we support that important public health objective. In its current form, the policy requiring asphalt sampling as part of a facility survey would place undue financial burden and undue logistical burden on us and other utilities, even though we are not the only ones working in the street. We project that it would cost SoCalGas $32 to $140 million a year to comply with the asphalt sampling policy. We believe cities, counties, and other stakeholders like Caltrans need to be need to share the burden of addressing a potential asphalt issue, not just utilities. For example, each year, we receive over 500,000 call before you dig notifications where cities, counties, contractors, and other utilities will dig through asphalt, concrete, or dirt above our pipelines. If cities and counties doing the work are subject to the rule, as Dr. Reese said earlier, they need to be brought to the table. SoCalGas would support the formation of an ad hoc working group through board resolution to address 1403's asphalt policy and other streamlining issues. We would be an active participant in the group and would support a district-led study that would evaluate how widespread asbestos in asphalt is throughout the four-county region. In the meantime, we are hopeful that we can continue to work with staff to streamline, survey, and asphalt sampling requirements for the critical work we do every day in the basin. Thank you.
Next is Stacy Taylor from Mesa Water.
Let's try that again. Good afternoon. I'm Stacy Taylor. I'm the External Affairs Manager at Mesa Water District in Costa Mesa, Orange County. I also lead the Buried Utilities Coalition, known as the BUC for short, and that does include the Association of California Cities, as well as over 100 members, most of which are water and wastewater agencies as essential public service providers located throughout the South Coast Air Basin. Regarding PAR 1403, the BUC does agree with the district on several key points. First and foremost, we agree that public health and safety are a top priority. As essential public utility service providers, BUC members have robust and in many cases award-winning environmental health and safety programs. Second, we agree that Rule 1403 does need clarifying, and along with Mr. Rothbart and his SCAP group, we do appreciate the district adding the call and go procedures to the rule. Thirdly, we agree that the district's staff report that proposed amendments to 1403 are not expected to result in any real quantifiable emission reductions. So the amends as proposed do not provide any added air quality or health benefits. Lastly, we agree that asbestos as a hazardous pollutant must be properly handled to minimize exposure. However, we do diverge on what that proper handling process is, particularly for water and wastewater utilities. And as with anything and everything, the devil's in the details. The BUC members believe that our current asbestos handling procedures, which are compliant with Cal OSHA and NESHAP, are safe and fully protect workers and the public. As such, we have three main asks with respect to PAR 1403, which we strongly recommend to make this workable for the buried utilities. First, a water utility pipe procedure specific for water and wastewater utilities, including the streamlined process that Mr. Rothbart mentioned. Second, a small jobs exemption for water utilities. And third, use AC pipe craft workers for the on-site surveys as approved by Cal OSHA for use when buried utilities presume that we are working on AC pipe. We would also support SoCalGas's recommendation for the working group on the asphalt issue. We did submit suggested edits to the rule on August 27th, along with a second comment letter reflecting our concerns, which have not yet been addressed by the current rule. We do appreciate and thank the district for participating in 2 industry working groups along with us, and the most recent was August 29th to review our suggested edits to the rule. Over a dozen BUC members testified last week at the September 4 public workshop on the rule. And following the workshop, some of us did receive calls from the district, which we greatly appreciate, indicating that they would be providing a written response to us. So the BUC does look forward to the district's timely response and we thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. Next one is Frank Priwoziak from Irvine Ranch Water District and the Barry Utilities Coalition.
Hello, advisory group members. My name is Frank Priwoznik with the Irvine Ranch Water District in Orange County, and I'm a member of the Barry Utilities Coalition. In addition to associating myself with the previous comments of Ms. Taylor, I'd like to add the following brief statement for the record. I thank you for listening to the concerns of the utility community and others, and for addressing a number of those concerns in the current version of the proposed amendments to the rule. We hope that you will consider the additional concerns that we have and address them accordingly in the final version of the amendments. The stated purpose of these amendments is to improve clarity of the rule. Please look at the current draft of the amendments with fresh eyes and ensure that reasonable minds will come to the same conclusion about the applicability of the rule. For example, as has been addressed previously, please consider what kind of survey would be done if it is known that there is no asbestos in the area. Additionally, I'd like to add that as a water district, we are subject to a legal mandate to provide service. We ask that the rule not, as an unintended consequence, potentially impede and jeopardize our ability to meet that mandate. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Next one is Cindy Parsons, local. Not sure where you're from LEDWP.
Hi, good afternoon. Cindy Parsons with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. We also have been participating in this rulemaking process. I think it has been a year and a half now. We've been actively engaged and talking with staff, multiple meetings, and I agree with a number of the comments that have been made, and as well as really, there are a number of good changes that are in the rule, but there are some key issues that do have operational impacts. And so the ongoing ask is for AQMD to fix those key issues to basically alleviate those operational impacts. My favorite saying is, don't let the paperwork get in the way of getting the work done right. So anyway, I do have a few comments. LADWP supports the call and go exemption to perform emergency asbestos work promptly without having to do paperwork and wait for approval when there is an imminent threat to public health or safety. We also support the expanded definition of emergency renovation, which now includes other situations that require prompt action. We continue to ask for a more streamlined approach to comply with the asbestos survey requirement for work on buried utility infrastructure to minimize the operational impacts. So having to perform an on-site asbestos survey every single time we touch our buried utility pipelines is very administratively burdensome. We're concerned about operational delays and inefficiencies in getting our work done. We're also concerned about unnecessary labor of having a CAC or a building inspector travel to and from the job site. There are multiple times that this happens per day, so it just doesn't seem like a good use of time. LADWP recommends including options for accomplishing the asbestos survey, such as using records to show that the material to be worked on does not contain asbestos, and if so, there's no need to have an on-site survey. For example, iron water pipe is not asbestos. Also, if the material is presumed and treated as asbestos, it seems unnecessary for someone to travel to the job site just to say, yep, okay, you're presuming. It just seems like a waste of time. So we're looking to find the balance between regulatory compliance and operational efficiency. We also echo the recommendation for a procedure 6, which would be a special all-inclusive procedure for work on buried utility pipelines. So it'd be like an annual compliance plan that would cover all contingencies. So you would not have to stop your work and apply for a procedure 5 if you ran into something that you weren't expecting. The plan should cover everything. The plan also should not require a case-by-case review every time you use it. So since work on underground utility pipelines is a common occurrence, and utilities do need to get their work done quickly, so we can get in and out and reopen the street, we really ask AQMD to consider some sort of a procedure 6 that would be special for underground utility pipelines. We're also concerned about the asphalt. AQMD is now requiring sampling and analysis of asphalt. We think that there are ways to address this that would not delay the work, such as using adequate wetting, which has already been suggested when cutting through the asphalt. Then the asphalt could be moved to a secure area and stored where you could send a sample to the lab. And if the sample comes back as, nope, there's nothing in there, then you just dispose of it properly. And if the sample does come back showing that there is something in there, then you would dispose of it appropriately. So we don't want to be presuming asphalt to be asbestos-containing material because that would unnecessarily fill up the hazardous waste landfills and it would increase disposal cost. So just in closing, I think in this case we need to think outside the box to identify the means of accomplishing this asbestos work safely and efficiently without getting bogged down in red tape that adds no value. Thank you.
Thank you. Last one is Greg Wolf.
Good afternoon. Greg Wolf with York Engineering on behalf today of the Buried Utilities Coalition. And I'm here to talk about asphalt. As David brought up originally and has been mentioned now several times, it's a new issue. Dr. Reese brought that up as well. It was something that came up during the course of this rulemaking, and it's become something that is of great concern to a lot of agencies and transportation authorities, as well as people that just have general need for getting through asphalt to get to their buried utilities. So during the rule development process, district enforcement staff have become aware of asbestos in asphalt, which was brought to their attention through, I believe it was a P5 submission. AQMD acknowledged during the working groups and industry groups that prior to this time they were not aware or had regulated asbestos in asphalt under Rule 1403. And AQMD enforcement and rule staff have tried to develop an approach that addresses asbestos in asphalt. Regulating asbestos in asphalt under 1403, whether in the rule's current form or as proposed, represents significant challenges. The rule calls for a range of sampling, labeling, and disposal requirements for asbestos-containing materials that are completely unwieldy when considering them in the context of asphalt. Moreover, there is a much larger question of applicability. Asphalt in and of itself is not a facility or a facility component, and while it is true that some renovations must involve removal of asphalt to access facility components, such as buried utility pipe, identifying and managing asbestos asphalt, including sampling, renovation, and disposal procedures, would be and should be completely different than other asbestos-containing materials covered by this rule. And then there's the obvious ubiquitous nature of asphalt in roads and associated with virtually all road work. Asphalt removed on many roads by Caltrans, local transportation authorities, and paving contractors and other parties are not subject to the terms and conditions of Rule 1403 in any way. And so regulating asphalt under 1403 is an incomplete response to this issue by its own merit, and opens the door to a much, much larger issue of enforceability. Therefore, the Buried Utilities Coalition recommends that asphalt be specifically excluded from the applicability of PAR 1403. It is reasonable to assume that the current rule would not apply to asphalt as a facility or facility component under that ground. And moreover, the district would not be aware of the potential threat posed by any asbestos-containing asphalt for projects that are associated with activities that are not covered by this rule. And they could then address that in this subsequent set of actions. So with the response of applicability to asphalt in the rule today, I think we believe that it necessitates to be excluded from this rule and then thereby pave the way for it to be a separate rule-making effort for specifically addressing asbestos in asphalt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from committee members? Seeing none. Oh,
Actually, I just wanted
David?
to chime in real quick for folks who may not have attended local government of, we're not a body that makes decisions. We can make recommendations and forward them to the board, but it's helpful to make comments so everyone here can hear this. Unfortunately, we don't have a board member to listen to that, and I encourage you to work with staff as I am on this and find some type of resolution to acknowledge staff's requirement to protect human health and the environment. So I'd really like to have a balance between getting work done safely, efficiently, and South Coast mission. So if there's, stationary sources coming up, certainly welcome to make those comments there, but I strongly encourage you to work with staff as well.
thank you, David. Carlos?
So just curious if this local government and small business assistant advisory group is allowed to make a recommendation. It seemed to me that all the speakers had one request in particular, this ad hoc working group be formed. I heard Ms. Hamilton and Ms. Taylor mention it specifically. Is it possible for that this group to encourage that type of formation of a working group?
Well, I think Sarah heard you loud and clear. It's going to be up to staff to determine whether we will form that.
But yes, it'll be up to them, but are we as a working group able to kind of formalize a recommendation?
I'll leave it up to our attorney here.
Because if so, I'd make a motion to do that.
I don't know.
Oh, well, we're
We
here
could
to
put
make
that-
it,
yeah.
aren't we here to be an advisory group?
Yeah,
We are a Brown Act committee, so.
You
So-
are a Brown Act
some-
committee, you are an advisory group. I can look into that real quick.
The
and see
part
if I can
that
get
I was
back
thinking
to you
about
on it.
why we'd be able to do that, it says advisory.
Yes, I understand.
So I
And,
would say that
this
we would
is- it's all-
consider advising,
Yeah, it's-
consideration respectfully to consider that working group if my colleagues here would also feel supportive of that.
As a friendly amendment, if we could,
well, I don't know if it's a friendly amendment. I think it's what it's going to be is going to be a motion.
Yeah.
Well, so moved. Do I have a second?
So
Derek?
make the motion, Carlos, and then get a second.
I'll reiterate the motion to support the formation of an advisory group as highlighted by the speakers, in particular, SoCal Gas and Mesa Water District, amongst the other speakers. This advisory group as they had described. That would be
Is
my
it an
motion.
advisory group? I don't think it's an
There's an
advisory.
ad hoc working
Ad
group.
hoc.
Ad
Yeah,
hoc
that's-
working group.
That's
Excuse me.
different from an advisory group.
Ad hoc working group.
Derek? Just as a point of interest, on the Home Rule Advisory Group, there have been several occasions in the past, not recently, but in the past, where Home Rule has written a letter to the Stationary Source Committee on a particular issue. So I guess that's some precedent at least.
I'm not aware of that, and I can't speak to that. I don't know, Nancy, if you know about that, but
Francis Keeler was on the staff at that time.
I'm sure it's, I'm just not aware of it, but I think what we can do, I think the best thing to do right now is to, you got the motion in, we get a second, you vote on it, and then Sarah's here to hear you out. Jill's here. Phil Fine is here to hear you out, and it'll be up to staff.
So we have,
I run home rule, so I'm familiar with that. And the way the home rule advisory group works is the report out of home rule advisory group goes to, I believe, stationary source committee. So that's an avenue that goes to committee first before it goes to the full board.
yeah.
This group, I was just asking Derek which committee that the report from this group goes to. That's an avenue to
Admin.
get that.
Yeah, I think with this advisory group reports to the admin
Yes.
committee.
Yes.
But I was just saying that Home Rule has done this in the past, not very often, but I forget what the issue was at the time, but we actually made a series of recommendations or something like that to the Stationary Source Committee for their consideration, so.
How about if we
And
do
just-
this, Carlos? Can we just table this for a second while Nancy looks into
I'm
it?
going to see if I could get you an answer even before the end of this meeting because we do have another presentation. My one concern is having you take a formal action on an item that has been agendized as a discussion item.
And I actually was just going to comment on that is I don't think we can take action on an item that is not actionable. However, I think we can give guidance to the staff to recommend to explore the advisory or ad hoc committee group.
Yeah, that sounds more reasonable.
Yeah, I'm happy to pull the motion. I think really the goal here was to strongly encourage and give direction to consider respectfully the request for this ad hoc working group. So
Like I said, they heard you loud and clear. I think that's probably going to weigh a lot
thank you.
in, and I don't know if it's necessary, but okay. Great, thank you very much. With that, we'll go to the next item. Hopefully it's not as lengthy. Next is going to be Victor Yip from Senior Enforcement Manager with Compliance and Enforcement, and he'll be giving you a presentation on our complaint reporting process.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the advisory group for inviting me to speak on South Coast AQMD's complaint reporting process and investigation procedure. Just an FYI, I gave a similar topic to the Home Rule Advisory Group meeting last month, as well as the EJ Council meeting, the EJ Community Partnership meeting last week. So I see some familiar faces here, and so just to let you know, we'll be talking a lot about the same subjects as I did before. A little bit about myself. My name is Victor Yip. I'm one of the Senior Enforcement Managers for the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. I've been with the agency for 21 years now. Started off as an inspector, worked my way up through supervising inspector, senior supervisor, and now Senior Enforcement Manager. I was responsible for areas in the city of Vernon, Commerce, East LA, those types of areas, highly industrialized areas. So today I wanted to talk about the agency's complaint reporting system. And so when a member of the public, I know this presentation is more geared towards educating the public on our process, but I think it's good information for the small business and local government groups here. When a member of the public sees an issue, let's say something like smoke or dust or experiencing some kind of odors, they can call in a complaint to our agency to file the report. We have two systems that we use to receive complaints. One of them is our telephone reporting system, which is the 1-800-CUT-SMOG number. It's 1-800-288-7664. South Coast AQMD, we accept complaints 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. During business hours, a complaint will be received by one of our radio telephone operators and logged in and assigned to an inspector for investigation. During our off hours, the complaint will be received by a voice message system, and we have a standby supervisor that monitors that line, reviews the complaint, and makes a decision on sending out an investigator or not. Just for your information, complaints can be made anonymously, and in these cases, it's a little difficult for inspectors to obtain additional information but based on the report, the inspector will go out and conduct the investigation. All complainant information, their identity, their location, remains confidential with us. We do not release that information whatsoever to anybody on request. We maintain all that information here internally and confidentially. The second avenue to file complaints is our web reporting system online at www.aqmd.gov. Using the electronic complaint form, the user needs to submit an email address, and there are fields for them to fill out in the same manner that they would if they were to speak on that to an operator. All of the questions that the operators have are indicated in one of the fields there. The third avenue is through our Android and iPhone app. There's a button for the cut smog number, and what it does is it brings up a call option for the phone to call the 800 cut smog. Internally, IM is working on enhancing that app to be able to file complaints directly through the app online, but that's a development for a later future. So just a little bit of information on the types of complaints we receive. We typically receive odor complaints, dust complaints, asbestos, gasoline dispensing, paint overspray, smoke complaints. During our no burn season, we receive a lot of residential wood burning complaints. And we just receive a kind of a category of other types of complaints. And these can be anything from an illegal business operating, or debris in an open lot, chemtrails or mold, anything like that. We do log in all of those complaints, and we still assign those for response.
Victor?
Yes.
Excuse me, on the graph, on your next one, at the last one, it says spots. What are
Oh,
spots?
on the graph?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So on the graph, under the last category, spots, there's this, we do receive complaints for these yellow spots that land on people's vehicles. And what we found through our sampling and research and analysis were that those were actually bee spots, bee dropping spots. But we do receive enough of those complaints for it to become a category and indicated on the graph. Using this graph, you can see the trends of complaints, total complaints that we've received over the years since 2000. And as the graph moves up and down, you can see that in 2008 and 2009, we had kind of the lowest volume of complaints those years. And we think that that's attributed to the economic downturn. Manufacturing was low, construction was low, just overall activity was lower during that time. In 2015 and 2016, 2017, we received the highest volume of complaints during those years, upwards of over 10,000, 11,000 complaints. In 2015 and 2016, we think the higher volume was attributed to some special investigations going on, such as the Aliso Canyon gas leak. In 2017, we saw an increase of complaints, possibly due to the investigation in Paramount. In 2018, we did receive over 10,000 complaints, and we feel that the outreach that LPA is giving and public knowledge of our complaint system is really successful. So the public is starting to learn that they do have an avenue to report their concerns to us. I did run some numbers for this year, and through the end of August, we've received 6,617 complaints so far, as opposed to 2018. During the same time period, we received 6,029. So it does seem like we are on track for another 10,000 complaints this year. So using the graph, as you can see in the blue band, the majority of our complaints are odor-related complaints. Last year, we received about 6,000 complaints out of the 10,000. The second highest number of complaints we receive are for dust-related issues. And then moving up the graph, you can see asbestos comes in third, smoke, overspray, and then this other category, which is just the conglomerate of different other activities.
Victor,
Sir?
on the last year of your graph, 2018, do those numbers include AB 617 complaints?
I'm sorry?
Do those numbers include AB 617 complaints?
Any complaints received from AB 617 communities are included in that total number. We haven't speciated those out from the total yet, but
they're part of the
that's
total.
part of it, correct, yes.
And Vic, just a quick question regarding capturing data. With chemtrails and you said bee droppings, right?
Correct, yes.
There's really not much you can do, but you're collecting that information just so you can show what types of complaints you receive?
Right. By our practice, all complaints are logged into our system and dispatched for investigation. So even if it's a chemtrail complaint where we don't have a jurisdiction over, we will contact the complainant to discuss their concerns with them. So it is logged and responded to.
That's what I meant. Victor?
Yes, sir.
Question. Time-wise, let's say it's a temporary odor. When I get out to Riverside and the back countries, I mean, these, like the slaughter trucks and these real smelly trucks, but it's only a temporary thing. But I'm sure somebody's going to complain on that.
Right.
I just know they do. So it dissipates, and then they call here. Now that's logged in as a complaint, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, even though the truck's long gone?
Correct.
Oh,
Correct.
I didn't know.
So if that information is given, that it was a past event, our operators will log that as a past event. They show the duration, the start time, and the end time. Our inspectors will contact that complainant for more information to see if there's a normal pattern, a certain time of day that we can strategize our position to be able to respond.
Let's just say that trucks leave, for purely a hypothetical example, they'll leave at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
I mean, I guess that's when they slaughter animals. And then just for an hour, it's really smelly, then it all goes away.
Right.
And if you pattern that, then is that still really a complaint or just a nuisance?
It's still a complaint,
Okay.
and it is a valid complaint. Whether it turns into a nuisance violation or not, that's based on our findings during the physical investigation. Yes.
Why don't we let him finish the presentation, wait for questions afterwards, or we're going to be here till 2 o'clock.
No problem.
Thanks.
Thank you. So for the next slide, this is just a simple graph of our investigation process. Complaints are reported to South Coast AQMD. They're dispatched to the inspector. The inspector conducts the investigation. So the assignment is given to the inspector through email. After our operator logs in the complaint, an email is sent to the inspector. The inspector will call the complainant for additional information, looking for things such as the time of day. Is it a regular occurrence? Does it happen only at night? Things like that. And it helps, this discussion helps the inspector strategize their investigation. After that conversation, the inspector will arrive to the site to conduct their inspection to validate whether the violation occurred or not based on that complaint. And once the investigation is done, our inspector will call back the complainant to discuss their findings. Sometimes, through that discussion, if the complainant doesn't want to call back, they just wanted to report it to us, we note that and we honor that they don't want the call back. So I wanted to kind of show a few examples of some complaints based on some videos that we've obtained either by the inspector or the public. So the first video is a fugitive dust complaint. So as you can see based on this video, this mound of dirt is not being stabilized adequately, and so the wind is carrying that dust across this property line. And so when our inspector arrives to the site, if they see something like this, that would be a fugitive dust violation. The next example would be an example of a smoke violation, visible emissions. Our inspector arrived to this complaint, noticed this dark black plume, took the video. The inspector positioned himself to read the smoke. They're trained and certified to read opacity, and based on his reading determined that there was a visible emissions violation. The thing about this complaint was that the complainants were stating that this smoke material was getting in their eyes, their mouth, on their skin, and this facility turns out to be a crematory. They were actively cremating a body at that time. So it was fortunate that our inspector arrived timely and mitigated. So since the highest volume of complaints we receive are odor related, I wanted to talk about how this agency regulates odor complaints and odor violations. And that's through our Rule 402 public nuisance. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it basically says that a person shall not discharge an emission that causes injury, detriment, annoyance to any considerable number of persons or to the public. And the key to the rule is that the considerable number of persons, that question is often asked to us, what does considerable number of persons mean? And that's evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So to give you a comparison, if we had a neighborhood with, let's say, 3 houses in a cul-de-sac, and it's the only 3 houses downwind from a facility, and we receive 1 complaint from one of the houses, to us, that would be a considerable number of people based on the geography of that location with the 3 houses. Whereas if we have a neighborhood of 500 houses, 1 complaint may not constitute a public nuisance. We may need more, something like 10 complaints or 6 complaints or something like that. So each case is evaluated against that kind of comparison to determine if a public nuisance actually occurred. When we receive a single complaint in a large residential neighborhood, that might not escalate to a public nuisance. It may be more of a private type of nuisance. One thing to know about the considerable number of persons is that the agency considers a single household as a single complaint. So 10 people living at the same location constitutes 1 complaint and not 10. We wouldn't need multiple households to complain. In terms of businesses, we do honor that the separate households or the separate people in that company will constitute a single complaint or an individual complaint. So 10 people from a company complaining will be 10 complaints. A complaint from a school. Now, a school administrator, a single school administrator calling on behalf of all of the students, we will take that single complaint and determine if the children in the school are affected. The number of children would be the considerable number of people that are affected, even if we received a single complaint from an administrator. So some of the challenges in confirming an odor nuisance is that a lot of things have to happen at the same time. Number one, we need to receive the number of complaints, the significant number of complaints verified by the inspector. The inspector will arrive to the location and needs to verify that odor with each complainant. Then they will need to trace that odor upwind and isolate that odor to the specific company as well as the specific source. So in this graph, let's say the inspector's tracking the odor upwind. They smell it in front of that first factory there. They'll need to go upwind of that factory to see if the odor is still present. If the odor is not present, then it kind of points them towards that facility. If they continue to smell that odor, they'll need to continue moving upwind and through the process of elimination, make that determination on the single source that's causing the emission. Now, if there are multiple facilities of the same type, there could be a determination made that several companies are contributing to this public nuisance, and that's something that the inspector needs to kind of go step by step through each plant to make that determination. And so that's kind of an example of a simple complaint where we're on land and we can kind of maneuver upwind and downwind. I wanted to give an example of a more complex complaint investigation where we needed to use kind of the non-traditional methods of verifying a nuisance and using more a technology approach towards investigating this complaint. And that would be some complaints that we're receiving in the coastal areas of Long Beach, Seal Beach, and Huntington Beach. Since 2016, we've received over 2,000 complaints of a sulfur petroleum type odor along the shoreline. And during these events, that the odors quickly dissipate. So by the time our inspectors get down there, the odor's gone. We're not really sure where it's coming from. So we conducted surveillance, and we've situated we've positioned our inspectors in the area to respond to complaints more rapidly. On one occasion, our inspector did pick up the odor and started tracing it upwind, which brought him to the sand, and he couldn't go any further. He couldn't get on the water to go find the source. But that information led us to look more towards an offshore source based on the wind patterns and being that he made it up to the shoreline while detecting the odor. So what we did was we employed our technology using our FLIR camera, our forward-looking infrared camera, using the optical gas imaging filter. During one of our projects, we used the FLIR camera to survey all of the stationary sources along the shore, our oil-producing facilities, as well as the platforms. Those findings didn't seem to be enough to create these large odor events. And when I'm talking about large odor events, we're talking about in a single event, we're getting 30, 40 complaints at a time, spanning from the shoreline all the way up through the 405 freeway. There was one weekend we received 400 complaints over that weekend of these types of odors. So we wanted to look at all the potential sources. During one of our surveillances of the platforms, our inspector decided to take the FLIR camera and look at one of the oil-containing vessels out in Anchorage. And what they found was a plume of emissions. When they switched over to the organic gas filter, you can see the plume rising up. And the difference between an organic gas and steam or water vapor is that it tends to trail off. The organic vapor will trail off, whereas the steam will quickly disappear. On this filter, I think we switched over to thermal, and you can still see the trail of vapors going along the hull there. This next video is a different vantage point, so you can kind of see the magnitude of that plume of VOCs. So with that information, we wanted to employ more technology to try to help us in our investigation. So what we did was we used sampling equipment. We used Tedlar bags, Suma canisters to grab air samples. And out of 37 samples, 36 of them came back with a petroleum signature. And so what that told us was it helped us focus more of our efforts towards these offshore sources, these oil containing vessels. So using online resources such as HighSplit, we're able to conduct back trajectory mapping. So at the time of the complaint event, we would backtrack where that air parcel could have come from. And you can kind of see the green and blue lines would tell us that at the time of the complaint, moving back several hours, the air parcel took that path. The pins were the locations of our oil-containing vessels. So the vessels within that track helped us narrow our investigation towards those boats out there. Using marine traffic, we've subscribed to that program so that we can track the location of each ship and when they arrive at berth. And so when they go to berth to unload their cargo, our inspectors will board the ship and conduct an 1142 inspection. To date, we've cited 4 vessels for faulty PVC valves, causing releases of these VOCs. And we're hoping that through this effort, we can mitigate the complaints. And so again, this is not a traditional way of investigating these complaints where we do the traditional upwind, downwind, and we're going after nuisance. We're hoping that this effort would mitigate the complaints in the fall September and October, which is the time that we receive the most of these complaints. We know that the ship operators, the captains, do speak to each other, so we're hoping that they cooperate and maintain their equipment to reduce these types of events. So with that, I'm open to any questions.
I think, Jeff, you had a question? If you don't mind using your mic, please.
I was curious if you've done any breakouts geographically as to where the different types of odor complaints are coming from.
We've created a heat map where showing the concentration of these odor complaints and where they're coming from. And so we do have maps that show what locations receive the highest volume of complaints. So yes, we have done that, if that's what you're referring to.
Any other questions? Seeing none, let's go to item number 6. That's the monthly report on small business assistance activities. That's at the back of your presentation packet today. And any other matters, any other business of board members, committee members? Yes, Felipe.
Yes, I wanted to raise the issue of the participation of AQMD on our Exit Advisory Task Force. I know that for the last couple of meetings, it seems that AQMD dropped out of participating in our task force. And at the last meeting we had about a month ago, at Resurrection, that was raised as an issue. And, I wanted to know if we can put it on a future agenda to discuss what happened. Why did AQMD drop out of participating on the task force, on the advisory committee?
So no, I don't think we really dropped out. What it is one was Dr. Joe Liu was not reappointed by the governor, and he was representing AQMD South Coast on that committee. We also, I know that we do interact still with DTSC on the Excite issues. I will find out why we're not an active member on the committee itself. But I believe it's a matter of finding a board member willing to represent the agency on that.
So it has to be a board member. It can't be a staff person.
I believe from the last, let me look into that, but I believe the last time we did this was the board or chairman wanted a board member to be on there, but I will check and see if they're willing to bring it down and let one of us represent the agency.
Yeah, because there was a lot of issues raised, and I think it's really important to have the participation. AQMD has been part of the process since the beginning, and we really miss your voice, on the advisory board. So I want to know if we can bring this up to the next month's discussion.
I don't think it's necessary for discussion. How about if I just update you at the next meeting as to what happened? I'll make this an action item and then update you on what's transpired.
And when can we have somebody come back?
As soon as my boss tells me we can.
All right.
Okay?
No, I'm saying as far as coming back on the board, on the advisory
Right.
committee.
That's what I'm
I
talking
want.
about.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Not a question, just a quick comment. These are such powerful microphones. I just wanted to commend AQMD on a successful environmental justice event yesterday. Really great turnout. It's great to see not your typical players coming to participate in the event. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. It was. So we had about close to 300 folks at the event. So it was very successful. Thanks to Fabian. Fabian and our staff put on that event. And it wasn't just our team, it was the entire district that helped us out, make it successful. Any other questions? Any other business? Seeing none, public comment? Is there anybody for public comment? Seeing none, they all left. Well, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. The next meeting will be on Friday, October 11th at 11:30 a.m. So I'll see you then. Thank you very much.